Thank you for joining today's Indigenous Conversations webinar. My name is Jamie Gaspar and I will be your host today. Our topic is Friendship Treaties with Carolyn King. Before we introduce our speaker, I would like to introduce Hashim Takvi, President of the Rotary Club of Mississauga, one of our sponsors, to say a few words.
The Rotary Club of Mississauga is a vibrant and active service organization dedicated to making a positive impact in local community and beyond. Founded on April 23, 1954, the club has been serving Mississauga and its surrounding areas for 7 decades. And yesterday we had our celebration. The club is part of Rotary International, a global network of 1.2 million neighbors, friends, leaders, and problem solvers who come together to make positive, lasting change in communities at home and abroad. The Rotary Club of Mississauga is known for its commitment to the Rotary motto, service above self. Members of the club are passionate about giving back and are involved in a wide range of projects, including community services, youth programs, international projects, fundraising events. The Rotary Club of Mississauga is made up of a diverse group of individuals from different backgrounds and professions who are united by their commitment to service. Meetings are held regularly, providing members with the opportunity to network, plan projects, and share ideas. Overall, the Rotary Club of Mississauga plays a vital role in improving the lives of people in the local community and beyond, embodying the Rotary motto of service above self in everything they do. Thank you.
Thank you, Hashim. Our speaker today is Carolyn King. We will be talking about friendship treaties. Carolyn has been engaged by government, colleges and universities, businesses and community organizations to do cross-cultural training sessions and presentations to help people develop a better understanding of Indigenous and First Nations people in Canada. She's the recipient of the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal in recognition of her support for First Nation history and advancement of the Indigenous peoples. She has been a driving force in the identification of the significance of current and historic sites within traditional territorial lands and the preservation of First Nations traditions. She received the Order of Canada, one of our country's highest honors, in 2020. Presented by the Governor-General, the Order honors people whose service shapes our society, whose innovations ignite our imaginations, and whose compassion unites our communities. Carolyn's appointment was for her expertise in community development, her advocacy of Indigenous-led initiatives, and her efforts to improve Canadians' understanding of First Nations. Joining Carolyn today will be guest Margaret Salt. Over to you, Carolyn.
Welcome to everybody, and I want to introduce Margaret Salt, who's joining me today. Margaret has been just recently, a year now, retired from the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation as the long-term researcher, lands and membership manager, or like director. And Margaret, I think you'd be glad to know that Margaret has like over 40 years of experience in land claim and research, and mainly on the land claim and the history of the Mississaugas. So she's very knowledgeable, and the whole topic of land claims, I know we call this one friendship treaties, but really we're going to talk about treaties because they're not really friendship treaties the way they ended up being. But I'll go through an overview of treaties and using pictures and maps, and Margaret will go through the more detailed stuff. So we can. I want to thank everybody for joining us and to talk to the Mississauga Board of Trade people and everyone who's online with us. That we have a long history with the treaty area, and you'll see the map a couple times about how big our treaty area is, and traditional territory, and I'll explain what the lines mean, and that the city takes our name. I just turned 75, so I have been around a long time, and I was around when the city took our name, and went down to a big ceremony and had visits back and forth to the community. And then the river, well, the river's been called the Credit for a long time, but it took our name too, because we're the Mississaugas of the Credit, and that the Credit is in relation to our business trading on the in the area, on the river mainly with fur trades, and that we paid the bill when we did exchange fur trade and for goods, that sometimes there wasn't enough goods to make the trade, and that we would pay the bill on the next trip in. And we became known as the Good Credit Indians. And I use the word Indian because that's the language we used before. And as that continued, we become identified as the Good Credit Indians. You know, our proper name is the Mississaugas. And so when the name was given, it was we were put in there as Mississaugas of the Credit to distinguish us from the other First Nations. So we can go on. First started the page there. Is somebody clicking for me or no? Okay. There's our first. There's the map. That is what we call the treaty map and the traditional territory. When you look at that, you'll see that there's a black line, a squiggly black line, and then you'll see all the colored blocks. Those are the different treaties that our First Nation signed, and this is all on our website, the First Nation website. What we call the treaties, which are colonial documents, they are mostly in straight lines, and that the traditional territory line, which goes all the way up to the divide between the Saugeen and the Grand River, as referred to as the height of land. And most of the time, those lines were identified by geographic features: the water's edge, the river's edge, you know, the height of land, watershed. So water, and mostly along the watersheds, because that's where our people live most of the time. And so they're not all straight lines. Okay, so that's a good map to know, and you can read about how those descriptions are and what blocks that were taken. For the purpose of this presentation, we're going to focus on the what shows up as the green, right along where it covers kind of from Burlington right into Etobicoke, that area there. So it's right near the bottom there. So next.
So when do you want me to talk?
I think this is yours.
It is mine.
Yeah, okay. Mark, I thought I was doing mine first.
I'm doing mine first.
But Margaret's going to do hers. So we'll let Margaret slip over here and she can
just come over a little bit.
She can talk to these.
I'll just turn your thing this
Yeah.
way. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for Carolyn inviting me to do the part of the treaty she just told me the other day.
Yeah.
But I find it interesting that more people are getting interested in the treaties, and I keep looking up on that thing. I don't know why, but I just wanted to give you a little background. There is a treaty week that's recognized in the first week of November, and it was designated in 2016 due to the Truth and Reconciliation. And it recognized our sovereignty and also created a lawful obligation of the Crown. So some of the things pre-treaty times, I always talk about that because what happened was, I always say the settlers came and they seen their opportunity, and it was the land of milk and honey, and that they took advantage of the First Nations. The First Nations had all their things, their justice, they had their own government set up in place. And so the settlers felt that they were superior to them, and that we were mainly second or third class people. So when the British through what they called conquest ownership, that's how they gained ownership of the fighting on there. So they seen the opportunity of all this land, and so what they did was they seen the value of the land, and they had their opportunity. So what they did in 1763, they put the Royal Proclamation in place. What that set out the process of how land were to be taken from the First Nations. But when you look at that, they put a monopoly on the land because it was only to the Crown that the First Nations could surrender their land. And even the thing of surrender, if you look at those documents, like how were the Indians supposed to look at, how were they supposed to understand that? They didn't understand the language. They didn't understand what the concept of treaties. So to them, it was like it was the right to go through land passage without being attacked or harassed or whatever. It was to them sharing of the resources. So there was a lot of misunderstanding of what the treaties meant. To the British, it meant ownership on there. To the First Nations, they didn't know what it really meant until the fences start going up, until they weren't able to utilize their way of life. So when the treaties were first made, it was gifts. Like if you look at the early ones, it was gifts, and then later on it become annuities, and then now the other ones are money. They gave them money, a very little bit of money. So Carolyn talked about the map, and it covers 3.9 million acres. And we're right in the prime areas of Toronto, Hamilton, Burlington, Mississauga, Brantford, Niagara Falls. So we have a very big area of treaties. So you want to go to the next one? So the first one that they entered into was the Niagara Treaty. And this one was, so if you go to the next page, I'll just say, so it's in that pinkish salmon color, I guess, along here, see the Niagara Falls on there. So they reserved some lands in there. And so when they looked and wanted to make treaties, most of the stuff was for transportation and communications and how they could avoid the Americans on there. So that's some of the things they wanted. And so in this treaty, they gave they made it with the wrong people anyway. They made it with the Senecas or the Iroquois. And then the Mississaugas, that was their land. So then when they took the treaty with the Mississaugas, they gave them 300 suits of clothing. But what really those 300 suits of clothing was supposed to be given to them for their military alliance. And so in actuality, they never paid nothing for it. But the thing is, they wrote about it because the Crown always said, get it as cheap as you can. So that's what it was. And it was to secure friendship for them, to be at peace with them. So that was the Niagara Treaty. So the next map shows the municipalities. You want to go to the next one? So this map, I really like this map because it shows more municipalities in there, what cities are in there. And you'll see in the middle, that little thing looks like a car down there. You'll see the Six Nations of the Grand River. And we're adjacent to the Six Nations on there. So you see that land up in the north between the purple and the greenish up there. that land was never surrendered. So we actually will have a claim for that later on. So that's that's a good map to look at. And when I first started and when the duty to consult came in, I got one of our proponents to make me a map, basically, because we were getting calls to say, are we in your traditional territory? Are we in your land and stuff? And I'd say, where are you? And so they tell me where they were. And so I got them to develop this map. So it's just been worked on and it comes to this one. So, but we had a really rough map before then, so. Okay, so the next one, I'm just gonna let go of the wording. You just can look at that. Between the Lake Treaty number 3 is the big okay, where's my map? Between the Lake Treaty, it's not on here, so this book is mixed up, I think. So this one was 1792. It's not showing. This is the Brant tract. I'm trying to look to see where the. It's not showing me that. Well, anyway, when you go back to that big map, okay, so go back right there. That big map in the pinkish there where I told you 6 nations. That was known as the between the Lakes Treaty. That was 3 million acres. And what happened here was the American Revolution was going to take place and the British was going to be fighting. And so they came to the Mississaugas and they asked the Mississaugas if they would surrender this land so that if they lost the American Revolution, that they could go to have a home for the Iroquois Confederacy and for the United Empire Loyalists. So the Mississaugas didn't want to do it because 6 nations or the Iroquois Confederacy at that time, they were traditionally, they were enemies, but at some times during history, they actually would fight together and join forces. So they talked to the Iroquois Confederacy, and so they figured that if they ever had to go to war against somebody, that at least they'd be together. So they agreed to the treaty. And it was funny because they took it before they fought. They lost, so the 6 nations was displaced. The Iroquois Confederacy was displaced from New York State. So the crown had the land whether they lost or won. So that's a big one. 3 million acres of land. So okay, the next one I'm going to go to see. That's between the lakes, but you don't see the maps on that one. Okay, so this one was the Brant tract. Is that little green? You want to right there? That little green one just there. That was given by the Mississaugas to Joseph Brant because he actually was their negotiator at one time. And this covered 3,450 acres, I do believe. So this claim we had in there, this was joined together with the Toronto Purchase when we did the resolution. But they went back and forth on this claim because the Mississaugas gave it to Joseph Brant, and they're always saying, well, you know, you can't do this because of the 1763 Royal Proclamation. So they finally got it straightened out, and that it was the Crown that granted the land to Joseph Brant. That's the Brant tract. Which ones they got next is the, okay, so the Toronto Purchase is that orange next. Right there. Okay, so then you got the big orange one. That's the Toronto Purchase. That was settled in 2010. And this one was a really interesting one because there was no surveys for it. They found out they said they took it in 1787, but when they went to Sir John Johnson, who took the treaty, what happened before that, there was no land description in there, so they had to take it over. So they went to Sir John Johnson. They said, what did you get from the Mississaugas? And And he says, he described a 10-mile square, the same as at Lake Simcoe, but it, over time, when the surveyor went out to survey, he was going well beyond. He was supposed to only go to the Don River. And the First Nation, the Mississaugas, were upset about it. So they brought the Butler Rangers in. And so he took a little bit there. And then when he went to go east, he wanted to go past the river. So he said, no, you're only supposed to go to the Etobicoke there. So it ended up being a 14-mile frontage and a 28-mile back. But they never knew, there was no surveys taken of the land, the 14 by 28. And so then they says, Sir John Johnson said it was a 10-mile square and 2 to 4 miles on each side of the carrying place. He couldn't remember that. So if you go up to Lake Simcoe, there's another little 10-acre square there, 10 by 10 there. So that was their route to go to travel more inland, so they didn't have to go around and not be detected on there. So they wanted the road around there. So in 1805, when they took the treaty again, they were supposed to got 4 maps. And so when they went to the Mississaugas and they said, well, what land did you give us? Then they said, well, we don't know because all our ancestors, our forefathers are gone. And so we trust you. Famous last words, we trust you. So the government only showed them 1 map, and this was the map on here. So that's that one was settled in 2010. So page down, that's the Toronto Purchase. Okay, so here's the next one is the greenish one there. So this one was taken right after the Toronto Purchase, and I've always called this one the Mississauga Tract on there because it goes right from the west of the Toronto Purchase right down to the Burlington Bay. Burlington Bay. And so they took this treaty, and here what they reserved in here was the sole fisheries at the 12 and 16-mile creek. So that was Oakville and Bronte, or Bronte and Oakville. Oh, by the way, when I was reading those things, they flipped them back and forth. So 12 and 16 miles creeks. And they also reserved the sole fishery, the Credit River, and the 1 mile. So you see those little yellow things, that's 1 mile on each side of the strip of land to its bank. So Bronte, Oakville, Bronte, and Credit River. I think I got those wrong, the Credit River, Bronte, and Oakville. So they reserved those in the fisheries and on this one. So that's how those were taken and separated out of them, and the rest of the land they said that was surrendered. And let me see what else I got on this one. Okay, so the next one. So this one was 648,000 acres of land. And I think this one was the first one that was an annuity. They surrendered the land and they were given 522 pounds and 10 shillings of good paid annually. And that works out to about $2,000, because if you say 4 pounds equals $1 or whatever, so it works out to 2,000. We still actually get those, goes into our revenue account in Ottawa. So that was another big tract of land there that were in exchange for goods, and I think that they had their fisheries in there. So we're going to go on to the next one. Okay, so here's the 12 miles, 16 mile, so that's those little yellow ones, and those are Treaty 22 and 23. So they, in those ones, this Treaty 22 was in trust because the Mississaugas had no more land. This was the only lands that they had left, was those three little strips there. And so they didn't want to surrender them, because if they surrendered them, they would be homeless, they'd be landless, they'd have no land. So what they did was they put it in trust to the Crown and said to keep it until they were ready to settle on there along the Credit River. So they did that, the Treaty 22. So now that's the one we have the claim in, is Treaty 22. And so what the government has saying, they even Winston Churchill at the time when they came to him and he said, you owe these people because they put it in trust to you. And so that's what we went on when we submitted our claim, that it was in trust. So in that pinkish one, that wasn't where the credit village was. And they reserved 200 acres in there. And that's where they did the Dundas, to build the Dundas Bridge and whatever. So we never did find out why they had that 200 acres, but they still considered that's 4,000 acres. They still considered that their lands, and the government never said to them, well, you surrendered this. I think I got that mixed up. The pinkish is the Treaty 23. And that's what they, that's an absolute surrender. But those ones in yellow, those are the ones we have claims for, and Treaty 23. So they were undervalued at the time. So that's what we're going through now, is that they were undervalued and we were shortchanged. The Mississaugas were shortchanged. So that's the ones we have a claim in now, and that's right where Mississauga is sitting on there. So you'll probably be hearing a lot about that in the next little while. So then the next one is the Rouge Valley, is in the pinkish. This also has an interesting history. This land was the Mississaugas of the Credit. So then the other, they were called the Williams. So in 1923, there was the Williams Treaty of Chippewas and Mississaugas. So the Crown went around with Commissioner A.E. Williams, and they wanted to do a cleanup treaty. So any lands that were not under surrender, they threw in a basket clause within this treaty. So in 1919, they met in Saugeen, and the Mississaugas were there. And A.E. Williams explained to them what they wanted. They wanted the northern lands. So the Mississaugas of the Credit said, well, we'll leave this to our brothers, because we have other issues that we're dealing with. And so you're not looking at our land. So in 1923, when they come together to sign the treaty, the government, the Crown, threw in the southern lands, and so they surrendered. Those other ones surrendered Mississauga's land. And so when the Mississaugas of the Credit heard that, they fired off a petition right away and said, why did you include that land in our treaty? So when we first started dealing with it, it was 63,000 acres, but there's more in there. And within that is the provincial Rouge Valley Park is in there. So we have a claim for that. And what we went for is because we weren't signatories. That was the good thing about it. When the Mississaugas and the Chippewas, they were called at that time the United Indian Council, they submitted this claim, and Mississaugas of the Credit and Moose Deer Point were kicked out of the process because um, uh, Mississaugas weren't there, and they said Moose Deer Point was immigrants into that, so that we got kicked out. So that was good for us, because then we were able to take our treaties and take our claims in. And so when they settled the Williams Treaty with the other First Nations, that went to court, and so they won. They had to compensate them $155 million for each of the First Nations. And so then they came to the Mississaugas of the credit, and they said, well, will you sign off on this so we can close this file? And we said, no, you got to settle with us. You surrendered our land, so you got to settle with us. So we actually put a proposal into the Crown, into the government, the federal government, and said, you settle with them, this is what we're asking. So that's our court case in there, because it was wrongfully surrendered by the other ones. And so that's the other part that we're in now. So hopefully we can, it should have been settled a while back, and this one, the province has to come in because it's 1923. So they were given the responsibility of the lands then. So I think I'm almost done. I think I am.
You did do the Toronto Purchase.
Yeah, I did the Toronto Purchase. Yep, I think that's it. So some of the things that have went, the federal government has the specific claims policy, and there's 4 criterias, and again, they're the only game in town that we were able to put treaties. Before, First Nations couldn't hire a lawyer, therefore they couldn't put claims in. And when prior to 1990s, we were not able to submit claims called pre-Confederation claims, or before Upper Canada and Lower Canada joined, we were not able to do that. So after 1990, the Oka situation, the Indian Claims Commission was created. So we never really had any recourse. If we put a claim into the government, they gave us the money to do the research. We had to submit it into them, and they made the decision whether it was a valid claim or not. So we always said they were the judge, jury, and whatever, because they also funded us. So with the Indian Claims Commission, when that was put in place, the First Nations were able to put pre-Confederation, post-Confederation claims in. So we were able to open the door. So when we was doing the 200 acres, we were caught in that situation. So when we were negotiating the 200 acres, they wanted us to surrender for the full 200 acres, but they only were going to pay us for, I think it either was 49 or 79 acres. But after 1990, we were able to take the full 200 acres in. So we told them at that time that no, we're not going to surrender the full 200 acres. We'll only surrender what. So we just kept on. Then we got kicked out of the process. They said they were going to change their policy. So that took us a long time to settle that 200 acres. Then it was a straightforward claim. The land was sold but never surrendered. I'm talking about the 200 acres. So treaties are interesting. So you see the government, how they've played. And I always say the treaties built the government of Canada. That's where they got their money from and whatever. And so now we're just asking to be treated fairly now in our treaties, because treaties cover almost all of Canada. So when Quebec wanted to separate, and I said, well, what they can do is give all the land back to the Indians that belong to them, and whatever is left, they can do it whatever they want with it. So we have that connection with the Crown. So that's our strong bonds with the Crown, because that's where the treaties were made with Her Majesty, His Majesty, and stuff. And so the value of the land now has, so that's the other thing in their policy. We can't go for the value of current market value. We have to go with what they call on block of what it was in the day, how much that land was worth. So there's still a lot of things that's still not equal on there. So that's just a little bit of the history of the claims. I better stop talking so Carolyn can do hers. So can I ask for questions now, because I have to leave at 1 o'clock? So thank you.
Hi, Margaret. Definitely questions. If anyone has any questions for Margaret today, there is one in the question question and answer area from Janice. What is the boundary between the Adjutants Treaty and the Head of the Lake Treaty? Where would that line be through in Brampton, Mississauga? And it's Ajetance.
Yeah, I'm trying to look at that on a bigger map.
The altitude, yeah.
So they all pretty well abut on there, and I'm gonna look back and see if I can see. So which one is that?
Adjutants Treaty and the Head of the Lake Treaty.
Okay, so I'm trying to, well, that's a pretty, I don't know exactly where the lines would be. I'm trying to look at them. So it's not really clear on even this big map to say where the lines are.
Janice has just popped up in the question area, Treaty 19 and Treaty 14 lines.
I don't know exactly where they are. We would have to go on the land description. What the lands are and see what area that is today. I don't know what the ones are today. But that's a good question. I should find that out.
Those details are in the treaty books that we reference all the time. They're produced by Canada or the government, and that they're very difficult to read though, because they go on, sometimes just degrees, that type of thing, and that.
Well, when you actually read the treaty, when they do the land description, it'll tell you, but you would have to have somebody, and it's probably out there that, like how Carolyn says they use landmarks, like up to this tree on there. So you would have to put that land description on a current map to see where actually those lines are. And I'm not a map person, so I know how to read a map, but I don't know exactly where those lines are. But that's a good question. I'll have to find that out.
Janice, if you'd like to connect with Heritage Mississauga, we'll try and dig into it with Margaret and see where that line is. Janice is trying to locate where her church is located. So that's why she's looking for those the maps and the lines. So we'll connect with you on that if you can get in touch with us. We also have another question from Tara. She says, thank you, or they say, thank you so much for sharing this learning. As an educator, I was wondering where I could get copies of these maps and presentations.
Well, you could go on our MCFN website.ca, and they have all the resources on there. And come to the C&E in the summertime when we're there, pick up booklets.
And that is all the questions we have, I think, at this point for, oh, no, maybe not. Just a second. Catherine just says, no question, but thank you for this review. I look forward to hearing more about the claims. Best to you, Margaret and Carolyn. And we have another question. Do you have any concerns about how long these claims are taking to resolve? And are there younger people involved with the same historical knowledge who can continue if needed?
Yeah, that's a thing, but it seems like our students, I don't know whether it's that they want to go on to something else, but it seems like they're not really interested. And I think it's very important that they know the history, and that's why we started the historical gathering, was to do that. And actually, we were going to do litigation for the Toronto Purchase. And we seen all the stuff out there, all the material that's out there and that's been created since the historical gathering has started, that a lot of professors and people like Donald Smith done his thesis, Heidi Brohacker did her thesis, and there's a lot out there that have done their thesis on the Mississaugas of the credit, actually, because we have such a wealth of information. But yeah, so I don't know, I never liked history when I went to school, but I really enjoy when I started working here, because for 2 years I read. I transcribed documents and stuff, and that's how I learned the history of stuff. So I just find it fascinating. I just find it fascinating that there's so much information on one First Nation, being the Mississaugas of the Credit. So yeah, we have to find ways, I guess, to encourage. And I like the thing with the Mississauga Heritage Society, those comic styles that they did. I always give those to the kids because that's one way they like comics and they like doing that. So I think the next step that we have to do is take it out of paper and put it on some kind of digital form, because they're always on their phones and computers and stuff. So I think we have to rethink, because you got a couple old school paper people here, and so we got to think how we can do these other things. And I know some of the things like First Story, you can pin a thing and go on your computer and see what the sign says. So I think that's some of the modern things, but we need young people to take up the cause and bring it into modern times.
Thank you so much, Margaret. We really appreciate all that you've shared with us today. There is so much to learn and so much that we need to understand. So thank you so very much for that. Carolyn, are you taking over now?
Yeah. Okay, that's the map you see that we talked about specifically about this. And as I mentioned down there, you see the line, the squiggly line and the straight lines, the ones in the colors. And like I said, those are based on mostly based on watersheds, how they divide, talk about the wall. Okay, so you've seen this map, and Margaret we've described that a bit about the next slide I have on here is the Mississauga Golf and Country Club. You see that building? That building is on our village, the Credit Village, and that it's over 100 years. That was it's over 100 years. I think celebrated a while back. So when you look at that, it sits on top of our historic Credit Village site, which is in Treaty 22, and you see the symbol that they have today. And you notice how they spell the name. Mississauga is sort of some older way that they spelled it. This here, just make a comment about Golf and Country Club there. This was their logo that they run by for hundreds of years, and that we didn't like it, and that we used to call it the Ugly Indian logo. It's still on the golf clubs and carts and stuff like that. I went down there and took these pictures, and that's so but they moved, taking it off of there, and it's off of the website, and they've taken a new name. So just so that times are moving and times are improving. This here, there's a little park pet which we worked with Heritage Mississauga to get in place. It's right adjacent to the Golf and Country Club, and it talks about the people, the treaty, and has some nice Carolinian plants, and then has placards there. Plus, there's placards, information placards around the city, talking about the Mississaugas and their existence there. So what I wanted to do, I was really having difficulty. How do you take all of this information? And I find it very complex to try to explain. All of Canada, almost all of Canada, including the Nunavut, is all treaty land. This here is just a map of Ontario, and you can see all the different treaties that were done. In all of that, 43, I think there are. So you just give me an idea about where the First Nations start to talk about their land, their treaty land, and how they should have been dealt with, as Margaret said, more fairly. So the next map is Southern Ontario. And you get to see from around the head of the lakes, Lake Superior there, that's the Robinson Huron. And if you've been hearing the news, the Robinson Hurons just settled their claim that they were given an annuity of $5 per person for taking of all of that, and that's the purple space. And they just won their case. And it's my understanding it's like billion. They got, and that's just where they were told they were the $4 or $5 they get was, I think it's 4, was to meet inflation and increase living costs. And the government never increased that. So they took them to court and won. And now they're just in the process of getting a payout for all the First Nations who were involved in that claim back then. And that's 1850. They call it 1850 and the Williams Treaty. And there's 2 sections to that. And in the lower part there on the green, that's where they get to talk about the Southern Ontario claims. And they're like pre-Confederation. Like, so these claims were made before Canada was Canada. And then this is the one that Margaret was talking about, where the Ashton claim is the 12, 16, and then the Mississauga claim and the 200-acre claim you see inside. And they were supposed to keep a mile on each side of the rivers. And in those discussions and what I read about it and my understanding, we were always supposed to be able to come and hunt and fish and gather. And what happened is they took the land, sold it off to the settlers as they come in, and that they just, as Margaret mentioned, the fences went up and we could no longer go back there. So the whole process of us not being able to go there is against the whole claim process, the whole treaty process. But that's still what exists today. Because, if you own your property, you have your property and it backs onto the Credit River, and we went there to go hunt and fish in the season, you might not be too happy. And there are lots of stories about that where people say, what do I do? The Indians keep coming back and they say that they have the right to fish here or hunt. And so that's what our people were told, and that's what we understood we could do, and then to be able to live. It was hunting, fishing, and gathering type thing. And as Margaret noted, when they did these treaties, we were not allowed to do it. So going back sort of in the general nature about what happened with the laws, that's what I want to bring in, that you say, well, why didn't you just do this? Why didn't you do that? There's lots of people can make comments about why we didn't do something. So the whole part about when did treaty making start, and this is what we call the colonial process for taking land. And when France, when Britain won, when Britain became the owner of the land in what we call North America or Canada, they beat the French down in the battle down there. And that then they wanted to open up the land, all of their land holdings. And that's when they started to use the system to make agreements with the First Nations. So that Royal Proclamation, 1763, where they issued King George III recognizes the Indigenous title to lands in the new Americas. Indigenous nations were recognized as sovereign nations, and so they treated with all the individual groups across the country. And treaties with Indigenous people must be handled by the Crown. So the government has always been, you might say, in charge of the process. And I just got this listed as significant legislative events that affected us. There was 100 of them, and I just tried to pick some that are kind of key. Aboriginal rights. The Constitution of Canada in 1982, our First Nations people were at that table and had to vehemently fight to be included in the Section 35, which, as we say, it entrenched the rights, they call it the existing rights of the first Indigenous people in Canada. And the word Aboriginal came into play. I always joke about that, you know, our right name is the Mississaugas, and then we're called Indians, and then we become Aboriginal, and now 2016 we became Indigenous. So we have to keep up too, trying to keep up with the label that they're putting on us over all these years. But we were there at the start, before the start of Canada, and we're still here. And this is the story that we're trying to tell you about how the lands and our relation to them are being affected. The next one that came in was pretty significant, was the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People. And the federal government released that report entitled, basically that the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, we call it RCAP. The report put forth over 400 recommendations, and to date, only 3 or 4 have been acted upon. One of them was the apology that was done by the minister of the day. The first one was the establishment of June 21st as Solidarity Day. We call it Solidarity Day. It's now called Indigenous Day. And then the Prime Minister of the day, Stephen Harper, later, he did the apology. And there's been several apologies by religious institutions about what happened, what part they played in, you know, putting our people in residential schools. The Anglican Church, the Baptist Church, all the different Pentecostal churches over the time have issued official public policies for the part that they played. In 2007, that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, it was adopted by the UN Assembly, and it recognizes, and these are people from all over the world, all the Indigenous people in different countries, the people to self-determination and the urgent need to respect and promote the rights of Indigenous peoples affirmed in treaties. And if you read those treaties, they're now kind of rewritten as opposed to if you read the original ones, they're really difficult to read. Margaret knows how to read them, but I was trying to read them, and they get so mixed up in the way they write, and even the way that they, in the handwriting and stuff, like 2 F's is an S. So unless you know how to read that, you really can't understand it. So we got modern books and that have, what do you call it, explained it a little bit better. And we do use them, the Donald Smith of them book. I don't know whether I'm not showing that as a base for a lot of the information about our people. And so you see in here, Canada and 4 other countries refused to adopt the declaration. And so it was actually accepted, what they call received royal assent on June 21st, 2021. So it's taken a while for Canada to come on side to recognize the Indigenous people in their lands. Another thing that happened more recent was the Truth and Reconciliation was done to research what happened to our people, the schools. And this was Phil Fontaine was the head of the Assembly of First Nations, and definitely a person who was impacted personally by being in a residential school, abused in all levels. And that was long process of asking the people what happened to them, or like what happened to them in the residential schools. And just horrible stories about whether they, and some forcibly taken out of the, away from the parents to go attend these schools, religious schools, either in the residential school system building itself, or like me, we went to schools on the reserve, what they call day schools, where we went to the school, but we didn't stay overnight in that, we went back home. And so that is still very active, the Truth and Reconciliation. And I took a picture of this because it's saying that the history of doing treaties with the people. You can say that this booklet, it shows the starting back in 1701 when they're making the agreement with the what we call now the Book of Shawnee of the Six Nations, all the way up to the Williams Treaty. So if you just think, it's different booklets that I use to try to tell the story, that there's a lot of information that people aren't told about how the land was taken. And then they don't understand why us as First Nations people come back to say, this land is still ours, or to be compensated, or the word is compensated or accommodated. Oh, I want to go back up. On the Truth and Reconciliation, that it's got all the 94 calls, and that's what we use. And this is now accepted by Canada. So the rest of the country now, based on the government's decision to accept this, that to enact them. And so people are promoted to take up those calls and to change doing what they're doing here, talk about this, promote that people better get a better understanding. And on my side, I worked in this field for a long time, not an in-depth treaty like Margaret, but until the 217 bodies were found at that residential school area out in Kamloops. What I seen a pivotal shift in the way that Canada looked at the claims by the First Nations or the Indigenous people. There was no, after that happened, there was no way that you could deny that these people were, died in these schools, got buried in unmarked graves. That, it basically hit home. And for me, as a person who goes out and talks about this, I see a significant shift in the way that people had to address it. You couldn't just say, oh, they're just saying that, they're just telling stories. And I hear things like that. Oh, that didn't really happen, type thing. But you can't deny any of this. And these now, there are research studies going on all across the country, even here at what's called the Mohawk Institute in Brantford, where our people, that's where my mother went to school, went to the residential school. Not for a very long time, but she did attend there. That they're looking with radar. There's a name. Laser. It's laser stuff where they go around with that little machine and they can see what's underneath the ground by the sound, almost like ultrasound. Anyway, so that's happening across the country now, being supported that they can, go and they know that their people went to the schools and they never returned, and they don't know what happened to them. So that is just to let you know that is very actively happening across the country. This year we talk about what are wampum belts. And this one here is what Margaret, you heard Margaret say, the Niagara Belt. And this was an early one that was come together with the government. You see, it's the 1764 is written on there, and it has symbols about the nations coming together, holding hands. And if those wampum belts were more symbolic, so that they're not recognized by the government as official land treaties. The First Nations produced them as historical record of agreements and occasions that were important to them. They're used by the Indigenous First Nations to tell the relationship to the land and the environment, symbolizing responsibilities inherent from time immemorial. When you see the 1764 is an important bell marking the ratification because the Royal Proclamation of 1763. That was the start of almost like where they need to recognize the First Nations, and that belt was made the year after Johnson, the minister of the agent of the day, made the belt to recognize what had happened in the previous year. He said, using a symbol that the Indigenous people use themselves. So there's a whole, the Niagara Treaty is a very significant treaty. And that you see that was the one along the Niagara. Niagara Falls is 4 miles on the west side of the Niagara River. And really, as Margaret was saying, they wanted to start roadways to build a country, put railroad tracks in place, have access to wood, all that kind of stuff. And that sometimes this belt is touted as the first charter for Canada, because they were making they took those 4 acres to protect Canada, so that the Americans couldn't come across back in that day. This is one of our band members, our First Nation members, Gary Sue, and he does a lot of our traditional knockings. He's holding in his hands what's called the wampum, the yellowhead wampum belt. It talks about who's responsible. Each one has a description. The marks on the belt that they describe what the responsibility of that particular nation is. And this is online. That's Gary talking to our elected council. So, and what are we doing about all of this? We go out and do talks like this. And so another thing that's very active in my life is the Moccasin Identifier Initiative. And that's the room I'm sitting in. If you see me sitting behind me, some of the, we're in that office. It's an education and awareness initiative about treaties, the land and the people. And you can see the website's there. Just call moccasinidentifier.com. And we've been working diligently for 5 years or so. And this started when I was working under Margaret. And the idea was to mark significant sites within our treaty lands. And we're using, as opposed to using a digital dot, which we will go back to, we're using a stencil. And that we go and yeah, now we web modern, like we have apps that you can load up the app and you can put a moccasin on your pictures and stuff like that and share it out to people. And we go into the schools. Our focus has been the grades 1 to 8. We're now expanding into the post-secondary, and we go to where anybody who asks us, we go out and we stencil. We work closely with the University of Toronto, Mississauga campus, and we have the students there, post-secondary students from around the world, listen to our story and to stencil. I have a great time. We have a great time. And it's the moccasin identifier is unique. It's non-threatening, it's informative, and it's making a difference. I say that the moccasin identifier has grown exponentially. It's now out of control and is dragging us down the street, down the road, kicking and screaming, trying to keep up. And that, and I said in my presentation about moccasin identifier, I talk about that I have a dream too that this province will be covered with moccasin identifiers in the next decade, and they will forever know whose land they're on. And I think that that'll help change our world. And that I think that if 10 years of education educating into the school systems, and I'll say I'm optimistic. The education system curriculum has been changing and improving, and the children get educated about the land and different parts of the curriculum. So I'm positive, optimistic that the world is changing for the better. And I hope people like you who are listening agree and help make that happen. I just wanted there's just tidbits about us here. Did you know that the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation own a house in Mississauga on South Millway, and it was donated or willed to the First Nation by it's called the Ida Armbruster House estate, and so she is a justice. She was a real justice fighter, and she when she died, she put in her will that the Mississauga Indians get the house, and so we still own that house, and it's rented out. So we've been around for a long time. This is a project that's being done. It was being done through the Mississauga Heritage Mississauga, I'm not saying it right, University of Toronto Mississauga campus. They did a project about documenting the history on the land. And this picture is up at the far point of the river, Credit River, and that they're using a very expensive machine there. And it's carbon dating. And if you see behind our colleague there, Jonathan Ferrier, and by the way, that's my son behind me, and the woman behind him is a renowned international person who does this carbon dating. They found petroglyphs, the drawings on the rocks that you can only see from the water. And so they organized a trip there, and a research trip, and they did the work to take a picture of it, and whatever that carbon dating is, that those are real, and that they're probably Mississauga or Anishinaabe on there. So that research is still getting validated. So just to let you know, we've been here forever, centuries. So Chimiwich, this is me, Carolyn King. They said they've received the Order of Canada and the honor of receiving it from the Indigenous Governor General. And so I said I was going to move it on to Margaret. So we're moving on to questions. Chimiwich, big thank you.
Thank you so much, Carolyn, for that. It's so much wonderful information, and we learn something new and wonderful from you and from Margaret today every time we listen to you. So thank you so very, very much. Are there any other questions in the that any one of our viewers would like to ask Carolyn? We do have a comment from Morgan. I'm so grateful that I had the opportunity to see a beautiful wampum shell this past weekend. It was stunningly beautiful.
Oh.
So that was really neat too. Yes, there are some wonderful opportunities that we can all participate in if we look for them. Thank you again. We really appreciate your time, and we appreciate Margaret's time and helping us to learn and understand and sort of bring awareness about all of the different difficulties and the journey that you've been on over time, and all of the great things that you're doing here in Mississauga. So we look forward to, we really look forward to everything that's going on this year, and Indigenous Peoples Day. There's going to be a big event at City of Mississauga, so at Celebration Square. So we look forward to that. And hope to see you very soon in the community. Thank you for joining us today as we continue our Indigenous Conversations webinars. We would like to thank Carolyn King for sharing her knowledge in this series and informing us on friendship treaties through an Indigenous perspective. We would also like to thank Faith Rivers for her continued support in this webinar series and as a director at Heritage Mississauga. Thank you to our sponsors, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the Rotary Club of Mississauga, for their generous support to bring Indigenous conversations to a wider community through this webinar series. Thank you also to Rotary President Hashim Takvi for joining us today. Thank you for joining us today. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow us to stay up to date on upcoming programs and webinars from Heritage Mississauga as we continue to celebrate Mississauga's heritage through research, promotion, and learning.